Hello everyone, I'm Santiago, and today I'm gonna be testing Dark Souls Remastered on the Geforce GTX 750 Ti. For performance monitoring, I'll be using CAM. If you want to download the software, there's a link down in the description. So Dark Souls Remastered, I'll be doing 1080p, 1440p and 4K. To skip to those sections of the video, check the description below. So first of all, I'll show you 1080p with the stock settings on the 750 Ti, so no overclock enabled. And so far with that resolution and maximum settings, I'm at 60 frames per second pretty much all the time. It might drop below 60 here and there a couple times into the 50s when you're fighting a boss fight that has a lot of fire effects or something like that. I don't take it as a huge deal because that's the big minority of the game. You're not doing that all the time. Then at 1440p, I just showed you two configurations, but I overclocked the GTX 750 Ti. I added 200 MHz to the core and 400 MHz to the VRAM. And in those two configurations, first I'll show you the lowest settings, then I'll just crank it up to the max to show you the two frame rate differences. Usually you won't notice much of a difference at first, but on low settings is significantly more stable. You drop below 60 frames per second way less often. You can still drop below 60 in some instances like many effects on screen, but compared to 1080p the drops will be way rougher depending on how much of the effect is shown on screen, but overall it's still a completely playable experience. And finally at 4K I used the lowest settings. And I wasn't aware of this before, but if the game is dropping below 60 frames per second, like literally slower, you'll be in slow motion if you're running the game at 30 frames per second. So yeah, we're getting 50% game speed at 30 frames per second. So my recommendation here is to play at 1080p or lower, so you get 60 frames per second the big majority of the time, and the game is not running in slow motion. In the options menu, we have very little options. We got vertical sync, anti-aliasing, motion blur, depth of field, and ambient occlusion, pretty much. The good thing about this one, compared to the Prepared to Die edition, you can change this in-game, so you don't have to restart the game, go into INI file for this fix. So that's good, we can compare performance very easily. It also supports ultra-wide resolutions, I tested that myself. It's just the original version with some small graphical improvements, plus some optimizations for modern hardware, for saying it some way. So it's capped at 60 frames per second, you cannot go over 60. That's why I enable VSync on all the videos in this game. Since we cannot go over 60, it doesn't make much sense to me to disable VSync. And well, the most demanding options so far, since we have so little, pretty much all of them have some sort of small impact. On my end so far, the most demanding options were anti-aliasing and ambient occlusion. Usually those two are the ones that make the difference. Then in places where you can see very far into the distance, for example Firelink Shrine, depth of field has a bigger impact in performance, but nothing too drastic. Motion blur in this case seems to be camera motion blur, which in my opinion is very annoying. I get kinda dizzy using it. I used it anyway, so you can see how it goes, but it's not a big performance impact, so be aware of that. If you already own this game, I wouldn't really consider rebuying it at 50% off, maybe wait for a deeper sale, but I agree with most people. This should have been a patch for the previous edition, the Prepared to Die edition. It runs a lot better. So far it has the fixes for the frame rate, so they fixed the physics, they fixed Blighttown, which is wonderful, and they also got rid of the stutter that happened constantly on the previous edition, at least on my end. So yeah, the game runs a lot better, much more stable. So my testing methodology here is going from Blighttown to the Undead Berg, or the other way around, it depends. Sometimes I did the opposite direction. As I said, Blighttown is fixed, so it runs a lot better, but overall the biggest performance hits were when a boss uses a fire effect on you. For example, the gargoyles, those can be a big impact in performance. So if you have a lot of GPU power to spare on Blighttown, for example on Blighttown you get 80% GPU usage or 70%, that's usually enough to deal with the fire effects. For example on my 1050 Ti video, that's the case at 1440p and below, but at 4K and Blighttown I get 99% GPU usage, still 60 frames per second, but once you fight the gargoyles you might get 30 frames per second when fire shows up, so that's something to keep in mind. There's also some minor stutter sometimes when traveling through areas. Not really a big deal if you ask me, it happens to me on Dark Souls 3 as well. But yeah guys, that's pretty much it. I hope you keep enjoying the video, thanks for watching and see you next time.